So I would like to welcome our final speaker up to the stage, Chris Rimondi. Chris and I met a couple years ago. He's involved in Child DevOps here in Chattanooga, a local meetup. Chris is a director of production engineering at Cofense, and he formerly was a site reliability, or he worked over the production, the site reliability engineering over at FireEye, correct?
Yep.
Yep. And he's also he has a podcast that he is a co-creator of, Pragmatic Ops. He's also a local Chattanoogan, so we're really excited to have Chris here. Take it away, Chris.
Appreciate it, Alex. Thank you much. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody the opportunity to come in and speak at a Chattanooga DevOps conference. I'm really grateful for the presenters and for the organizing team on the DevOps side here that's put this together. This is really cool. As Alex said, I am a local speaker. I have the opportunity to work with these guys and see some of these cool presentations. And I'm also really excited and grateful I get to speak to you guys about system thinking. System thinking has been something that I've been really kind of digging into over the past year and a half. And when we went back and forth and thinking about what would be an interesting topic to present, I was excited to speak about system thinking because I think it's so applicable to so many different areas. And hopefully you guys will see that through the presentation, and we'll dig in a little bit. But just a quick note on who I am. Alex gave me a little bit of a intro. Senior Director, Prod Eng at Cofense. We're a cybersecurity company. We make phishing mitigation software. We're actually based out of the DC area. I do work from my house here in Chattanooga, though. So I've been running stuff in public cloud since about 2013. My professional career has been mostly focused on security, cloud, operations, that type of thing. On the local board of directors for the ISSA Chattanooga chapter, so we've got a chapter here. If you're on the cybersecurity space, you're in this area, definitely check that out. Hit me up after that. We're extremely proud about that. For 2 years, 2 of the past 4 years, we've won the small chapter of the year award with the ISSA. So really excited about those type of things as well, and it's just great to have this local feel. Let me give you my introduction to system thinking. It's not going to have anything to do with DevOps, more of on the physiology side of the house. But I remember, man, at this point, over 15 years ago, working at a gym, and we had a nutritionalist there. And they brought this, one day there's a box of like these food scales. And these food scales were meant to give the clients the opportunity who are looking as part of this diet program. The idea was they would take their food and they would weigh their food. And the reason they would weigh their food was because there was like a calorie conversion chart or something like that. So if you had a piece of chicken, you would put it on this scale and you would figure out how many grams it weighed, and then you would convert that to calories. And that was actually part of a kind of a larger thinking, and still a lot of way it is today in terms of dieting, is there was a overall thought that dieting was simply calories in, calories out. That whole process was extremely interesting because what people would do is they would measure their calories that they're taking in during the day. They would measure the calories or estimate the calories they were thinking they were expending, and the net between those two was supposed to actually figure out how much you were going to lose, or if you were going to lose any weight. That was really tidy. It kind of followed the laws of thermodynamics. The math was nice. You could really get a lot of you could sell people on that simplicity. The problem is it didn't work for any of our clients, and it hasn't worked for the past 20 years since it's been kind of in vogue in terms of the dieting landscape. And what made me think about that was from a systems perspective, like, well, why isn't this working? Like, the math is there. I mean, we have everything kind of together, right? I mean, it does make sense. I mean, you could kind of burn a calorie, it takes X amount of energy, and that's just where it's at. But the reason it wasn't working, and I want to ground this in a distinction between understanding the difference between linear thinking and system thinking. So before we kind of dig in on what actually system thinking is, let's put it in juxtaposition to system thinking. So linear thinking is just this. It's going to be that idea where you, in order to rationalize about a series of events, are going to kind of experience them in a particular order. So that order that you're experiencing them in leads to a belief that there's a very simple cause and effect between events and that are happening in sequential order of one another. And there's also a close temporal relationship between those events. And honestly, my job here is I didn't want to like berate linear thinking because it has its place. If you want to rationalize about a hammer driving a nail into a board, well, that's a very straightforward, simple cause and effect relationship. The hammer striking the nail is the cause, the nail going into the board is the effect, and it's entirely appropriate to rationalize about certain situations from a linear perspective. However, it falls down when you get any level of complexity. And this idea of system thinking really attempts to look at the holistic view of all things. You're trying to step back and say, what is the system doing as a whole? There's in all likelihood a very dynamic cause and effect relationship. So you can have many causes can have one effect, many effects can be from one cause, and in all likelihood, many causes can have many effects. And it's understanding that view with the addition that in all likelihood, there is going to be a distant or a far temporal relationship between the causes and the effects. That at its heart is system thinking. And that's why for us who attempt to like understand the systems that we're building, organizational or technical, this becomes so difficult. Because many times there is not that direct, easily observable relationship. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a system. I'm going to quote liberally from my presentation from Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, a Primer. She defines a system as an interconnected set of elements that are coherently organized in a way that achieves something. That is so important. That's why I underlined the example there. You have a system is elements, things that have relationships, some type of interconnections that are actually built to achieve something. That something is how we can rationalize about what a system is, what they're built to achieve, what they're designed to achieve. Now, going back to kind of the physiological example, our body is actually a system. And that's the reason that simplistic approach to calories in, calories out never works. To further expound, our body is a system with a function. Its function is not dying. Because our body's function is not dying, what ends up happening, specifically as it relates to like the metabolic capabilities of it, it does not that process of not dying by keeping a proper amount of energy in our systems, and that energy is really qualified as fat. So what happens is if you want to understand our metabolic functions, you have to reason about its behavior and understanding its holistic function. And I think that's a lot of, this kind of thought process is really probably coming into more popularity, and I'm grateful for that, kind of casually follow the health science space. This is really getting there. But the idea that you can manipulate your human body as almost as a machine, or even a simple machine at that respect, without understanding what it's trying to do at the hormonal level is kind of moving away from mainstream, which I'm glad for. So the past 20-ish years or so have been really going there. Now, the reason I brought all this up and trying to understand why talk about DevOps and system thinking together? So if we're moving away from kind of like the health example, why go from that example and start with that? Well, the reason is because learning about systems is highly leverageable. And the reason I say that is because whether you're dealing with economic systems, whether you're dealing with financial systems, whether you're dealing with biological systems, whether you're dealing with technological systems, what you end up with is that all systems exhibit certain emergent properties that are independent of the type. And so I'm hoping during this presentation, there's almost like a 2-for-1 effect of this, that we're going to learn about essentially systems against the backdrop of DevOps and software, but at the same time that we're all going to be equipped in different areas, not just in our software and professional lives, but all the other types of areas, whether it's examining economic models or physical models or health models, and really kind of extracting those benefits and lessons learned in systems. Systems, I'm going to look at them in 3 parts. We're going to talk about the components of a system. We're going to talk about what I'm calling the grammar of a system, and then we're also going to look at the archetypes of a system. And again, doing this all hopefully against the backdrop of DevOps and software. So what are the 3 components of a system? I kind of alluded to that in the system definition. The first one is elements. Those are the things that make up the system. The second one is interconnections. And then finally, you have this idea of purpose or function. Now, usually we use the term purpose if the system is like sentient beings, it's intelligence, it's a human organization or an individual. We use the term function if it's like a non-living thing, like it's a design thing, like the power grid could be a system with a function of delivering power. And what I would argue here is that each of these elements are absolutely essential to having a system, but only one of them gives you the most leverage if you want to rationalize about the behavior of that system. And that one is its purpose and function. So I want you to just imagine a professional basketball team. Professional basketball team has its elements. You could say it's the players, perhaps it's the coach, it's the fans, it's the jerseys, it's whatever else that's part of that. They have relationships with one another, with themselves, with the people on the team, with their opponents, with the coach, and so forth. And they also have a purpose or function. If it's a professional basketball team, maybe it's winning games such that to make the owner money, something along those lines. That could be its purpose or function. Now, you would argue that, for example, that professional basketball team, if you looked at it 30 years prior, it probably had a completely different set of elements, completely different set of players and jerseys even, and all that kind of thing. But today, you can still recognize it as a professional basketball team because it shares a common purpose and function. And that's kind of important. It's a little bit academic, but keep that in mind. We're going to be talking more about that. So with DevOps, you have this idea that the inherent is that you've got two different types of systems, development systems and operation systems. And DevOps was the idea of bringing these together with a common purpose or a common function. That's really what the genesis of the movement, I think, has been about, is because you have maybe some conflicting purposes or goals within these systems. And I would argue that the founders of DevOps actually understood some of these foundational principles, such that development and operations teams are not just their systems within themselves. The dev team and the ops teams are systems within themselves. They're elements in an overall product system, but they're also systems within themselves with their own elements, with their own interconnections, and with their own purpose and function. And that is actually pretty critical, and it's actually a common pattern that's repeated because elements in one system are kind of like recursively going down. They end up being systems within themselves. So these teams, development and operations, have all their own parts and elements and configurations. So how do we understand that conflict? This has been something that's kind of, I've looked at a couple different thought processes from the world of system thinking. The first one is I want to introduce you to this topic called sub-optimization. And sub-optimization is when a system's goals dominate at the expense, or a subsystem's goals dominate at the expense of the total system, resulting in behavior that's called sub-optimization. Sub-optimization is, I think, again, it's a concept that we can really run with because it happens over and over and over again, not just in our own organizational systems. I just sat in a kind of our security talk from our open spaces where we talk about, this is like natural enemies. It's security and operations. It's security and development. It's operations and development. Those things are happening. The kind of phenomenon from a system standpoint is something called sub-optimization. And it's when the elements are systems within themselves and they're actually acting, their purpose and goal is kind of at odds with or not completely optimized to the overall system's goals. Now, the second thing I want to bring up is this topic called bounded rationality. Bounded rationality is a concept that, and this is maybe a little bit more fair, is that people make, in general, very reasonable decisions based on the information that they have. I like to almost call this the benefit of the doubt phenomenon. That if you walk into an organization, most of the time, people are going to try and attempt to make the very best decision with the set of facts that they have on them. Now, that idea of bounded rationality is kind of impactful in a lot of different ways. But it should help us approach like people on our team or people on other teams with, they're just trying to do their job. One of the things I brought up in the security open space is that I'm grateful for working with a security team that, realizes that every time there's a request coming into security, they say, at the other side of that request is just somebody trying to do their job. So bounded rationality and sub-optimization are pretty critical. But let me give you a cool example, I think, on how this manifests itself. This is these two things coming together. I want you to imagine you're walking out of your house one day. And as you walk down the stairs, you're looking at your neighbor's driveway, and there's your neighbor. Your neighbor is building a boat, like a personal sailboat or something. And out on your neighbor's driveway, he's got the wood, the sails, the tools, everything necessary to build a boat. And you ask your neighbor, so what are you doing? And your neighbor says, well, I'm kind of taking up this whole boat building or shipbuilding. I've become an amateur shipbuilder. And everything that he needs is right there building that personal sailboat. So he said, that's pretty interesting. And you kind of continue on walking out of your house, and you live somewhat close to the waterfront. You go down to a shipyard. And as you walk into the shipyard, you kind of think, similar type of things are going on here. You walk into the shipyard, and you see a bunch of people doing a bunch of different things. And then you go to them, and you say, hey, what are you doing? When he says, well, I'm a welder. You go to another next person, you say, hey, what are you doing? And, I'm a plumber. And another person, well, I'm a project manager, right? So all of these people are doing all of these things. Essentially, they're building ships at a much larger scale. But the ironic thing, which leads us to this particular phenomenon, is that people in systems do not do what the systems say they are doing. The book Systemantics. If you let that settle on you, you have just wandered into, honestly, a shipyard where people are doing much higher level, building at a much greater scale, yet nobody in that shipyard identifies themselves as a shipbuilder. Yet your neighbor who's just building that boat by himself identifies himself as a shipbuilder when he's the only part of that system. That should tell us that there's a qualitative difference between simple systems and complex systems that actually are kind of inherent in what we're dealing with. And that's not necessarily all bad. We should take pride in that type of functional understanding of our vocations. But at the same time, I think it speaks volumes to the overall inherent conflict that we see in the organizations if we're dealing with any type of software delivery organization. So the question is, how do we fix this? How do you deal with this if you're dealing with it at New York? I'm going to just pull another quote here from Systems Thinking, is this. It says, usually by providing an overarching goal that allows actors to break out of their bounded functionality. This is so critical. When you take an organization and you say, your purpose or your job is the overall business value that you're delivering, that the company is delivering, there's a lot of DevOps to be said about cross-functional teams and raising everybody up. System thinking has known this for a very long time. And their approach to the problem is, people who are dealing with system thinking, is such that we have a bounded rationality problem. And when you give people an overarching goal, it naturally stretches their kind of mind and process to thinking that what they do is not just grounded in purely the functional thing that they're doing, it's grounded in the overall organizational purpose of that which they're providing value on. So again, I would highlight, if you notice, what differentiates a system is its goal, function, or purpose. What fixes the bounded rationality problem is its overarching goal. Keep that in your mind. We're going to keep on moving forward here. Now, what I want to do, we're going to take a look at system grammar now. And what I'm hoping to do with this is I would like us to kind of go on a journey together, and I want us to build a product development system via the components of system grammar. So we're going to look at kind of three main, what I'll call grammatical constructs of a typical system. And we're going to build our own product development system, and we're going to try to think about and rationalize what that looks like. So the first one I want to talk about is a stock. A stock is very straightforward. I'm going to call it in grammatical speak, it's actually the object of the system. It's that entity which can be perceived. It's that entity which is acted upon. Usually it's represented as a square. It's some type of scalar. Money in a checking account. It could be trees in a forest. It could be the temperature in a room. Whatever it is, that stock is perceived by actors within and outside the system as being something worth looking at. Usually it's very slow to change. Usually it's kind of called like this, the shock absorber of the system. Because whatever that system's behavior is, that stock is almost, for those of you who may be familiar with Kafka or whatever, it's the immutable log of the system. The stock is the historical record of all inflows and outflows into the system. That's what a stock is. And if we were considering this in light of a product development system, I want you to imagine that our product value is the stock. Okay, our product value is the stock. If we're building software, whether in an IT or a product organization, we have some perceived value of the software we're building. Many times it correlates to what our customers or stakeholders think is the product value of that system. And that value could be, maybe it's best quantified if you had to quantify number of sales or how much you're delighting in customer surveys. But our product value is how we're going to consider. This is kind of our first building block as we build our product development system. So the stock is product value. Moving on to the next component, flows. Flows are what I'm going to call the verbs of the system. They're the entity that does the acting. Now, they can be changed with loops, and we'll get there next, but usually they're a vector. There's two types of flows. There's inflows and outflows. Some examples, maybe the interest rate, the money coming in, the lumber rate, the heat escaping rate. These are all type of flows that are coming in and out of like physical systems. Very straightforward, but what I want to think about is in context going back to our product development system. So if you have product value, how do you increase your product value? Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do that, but there's actually I'm going to say that the inflow into increasing your product value in that stock is your development. Yes, maybe that can encompass marketing or product management or project management, whatever else it is. But for simplification's sake, let's just say if you want to increase your product value, you have to do some type of development into your system, okay? You have to build something of value. You have to solve somebody's problem. Now, I'm going to take it one step deeper, and I'm going to say that development can actually have a ratio tied to it. And I'm going to say that your feature development divided by your feature development plus your quality development equals something called the feature dev ratio. And what I mean by this is, imagine your software developers are out there building features. They're out there, you're doing your thing, they're building features for your customers. Some of that work goes directly to actually the features. Other part of that work goes to your quality, stuff that's like NFRs, non-functional requirements. So if you imagine like a typical 40-hour work week, if the development and engineering team is spending 24 of those hours on feature development, things that the customers are directly going to see, the other 16 hours on I'll call quality development, things that are not necessarily going to see, but necessary to kind of keep the system going, you would have a 60-40 or a 60% feature dev ratio. That's what I would call like the development inflow into the product value. But that product value also has an outflow. The value doesn't remain constant, does it? If you built a system and just left it there, would it remain the same as valuable? As valuable as it was on day one as it was on day zero? The argument is no. I would say that software, like any other asset, is going to have a depreciation curve. That depreciation is going to drain your product of value that it needs. What do I mean by that? What are some of the factors that goes into depreciation? What causes software to depreciate? One thing I would say is increasing system load. Ideally, if you have a system that's scaling, maybe you can scale a system up to a certain extent. If you have too many people on the system, too many people using it, that's going to cause availability issues or maybe at best performance issues. That software is less valuable to the customers that are originally using or value per customer if there's a million customers on it that are causing performance and availability issues. So that product value can be drained by its increasing system load. The product can also be drained of value by security vulnerabilities. Even if at day zero, you shipped a piece of software that had 0 critical or 0 high vulnerabilities on it, 6 months down the line, if you've watched it, any type of open source component, Apache and Nginx or whatever else you're throwing into it, is going to have a steady stream of CVEs or vulnerabilities expressed in that. And it is less valuable unless you change those and patch those things, it is less valuable than the day you shipped it because you have more security vulnerabilities in it. And finally, technical debt. And I'm not just talking about bugs here. Again, let's imagine day zero. Day zero, you ship state-of-the-art, the best way possible, conceivable to build a system. If 18 months from now, you were to build the exact same system, you would probably take advantage of a little bit different tech. You would maybe utilize some cloud provider, platform as a service, and so forth. All of that would be different. And there's almost a second mover advantage for your competitors where if they built the exact same functionality today as you built then, not only would they have advantage of kind of starting greenfield, but they would not have to deal with figuring out upgrades and migrations and so forth. So all of those, and probably more if we sat here and thought about it, are factors which kind of go into the depreciation of the software. I'm going to encapsulate them in something I'm calling an engineering quality kind of variable here. The higher the quality of the engineering software you're shipping, the less likely it's going to depreciate. And higher quality software is going to depreciate, or higher quality software is going to depreciate slower. Lower quality software is going to depreciate quicker. Hopefully that just kind of makes sense with thinking about things. You buy something that's cheap, you're going to end up throwing it out in a few weeks versus something that's high quality, it's going to last for a while. So what I'm doing is I'm putting these variables on this system here. We have our feature dev ratio, which is going to impact the overall development inflow. We have our engineering quality, which is going to impact the overall depreciation outflow. And I would argue that those things are tied together. There's a strong relationship between each of those. The more cycles you spend on quality engineering and the lower your feature development ratio is, the slower your software is going to depreciate. The more time that you buzz in and do on feature development, the higher that, and the less you spend on quality engineering, the quicker your software is going to depreciate. It's going to suck out the value of that. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is loops, and this is what really set these things apart, is loops are going to be the adverbs of the system. Think of it this way. They are the thing that basically describes the flows. They are dependent on the value of that stock, so the product value, and they're represented by curving arrows. Usually, there's two types of loops. One of them is, the first one is called bouncing loops. Those bouncing loops is maybe, sometimes they're called negative loops. I think I actually like bouncing better. Usually, they kind of drain the stock, but sometimes they can represent the stock that actually, it will attempt to keep a stock at a certain level, so it could actually plus or minus on a flow. The other one is called reinforcing loops. Those actually only go in one direction, which is positive. You would argue that, so for example, money in a checking account, interest accumulated is one. The more money you have in your checking account or savings account, the more interest you're going to receive, which puts more money in your savings account and so forth. And the cycle goes on and you have a reinforcing loop. Now, as we approach the system here, this is how I'm going to argue our product development system looks from a looping standpoint. The one on the right, the bouncing loop, is impacting the depreciation. I'm going to say it's not as interesting. I want us to focus our attention on the one on the left. Because here's what ends up happening. Is you have that organization that somehow you have, again, a perceived value on that stock. You say that our product value is X. You identify a discrepancy in that stock, and you say, I see the product value as X, and I really want it to be Y. Based on the size of that discrepancy is what you're going to do and make a decision on how you're going to actually play out the feature development ratio. I think many of us have probably been in this situation where if things are not going, if you're not perceiving or if you're running late, you're stepping on the gas to kind of get there sooner versus perhaps if you're right on time or you have some time to kill, you're not traveling as fast on the highway or whatever. Same type of effect here. There's a loop which basically says somebody sees a desired product value. They notice a discrepancy in what that product value is now, and they adjust the loop based on and they adjust your development inflow based on what they perceive that to be. So this kind of holistically is I would say, at a very high level, this is a product development system with all the grammar of a normal system, stocks and flows and loops. So let's talk a little bit about archetypes. And I'm going to come back to that diagram in just a second. In fact, I'm going to look at it right now. But the power of archetypes is really why system thinking is so fundamentally leverageable. Because what I showed you here on the product development system is surprisingly, and maybe not so coincidentally similar to an economic capital system. You can swap out the names and so forth. For example, instead of feature development ratio, you have investment fraction. Instead of engineering quality, you have capital lifetime. Such that how long does my bulldozer, like if you're talking about capital in terms of bulldozers, does my bulldozer last 15 years, 20 years, 25 years? The shorter your capital lifetime, the quicker that asset's going to depreciate. And I think you can, and this is why I would argue there's so much you can learn from the different economic models out there and the different system models out there. There's these archetypes that are really, I think, applicable to the software world as well. And both of these models, both of these software diagrams, I would say, are actually subsets of a larger archetype called the biologiit's population model, which is a little bit simpler, which is straight up, if you have a biological population, there's a reinforcing loop. The more people, if it's human beings, the more people you have, the more births you're going to have, which can produce more people and so forth. And both of those, both of the inflows of births and the outflows of deaths are going to be mitigated or impacted by the fertility rate and the mortality rate. So again, we've looked at, there's a biological system, there's a technical system, there's an economic or financial system that all kind of follow the same type of model here. And then if I'm really doubling down, I'm going to go back to my biological, my physiological system and argue that our metabolic system is just that the same thing too. Stored energy in the terms of fat, you have food intake, you have activity, and your body, even though it's not like your mind necessarily, is perceiving an energy level in your body, and that energy level is actually impacted in both directions by something called hormones. And you really get into trouble with, when you end up with those hormones start malfunctioning, like you have insulin resistance or leptin resistance or ghrelin is out of control and all these other type of things. But that's really where we've really looked at a bunch of different system models. And I think hopefully you can see the power of archetypes. If you get system thinking, you're going to see applications in a bunch of different places. Now, let's go back to our product development system. Another way to visualize the benefit of this system is many times the system designers will build this, system thinkers will build this diagram. They'll do something like this, and they'll say, this is how I conceptualize it. But then they'll turn around and they say, I want to actually plot the value of a particular variable. In this case, we'll say the product value over an XY, a typical XY time plot. If you have a healthy system, if you have a healthy growth, you will have something like this. You will have product value plotted on the Y, time on the X, and you'll have consistent product value growth. I want you to notice something here because this is actually on purpose. Notice that this is linear growth. This is not exponential growth. And I've worked for companies in Silicon Valley, and I get the fact that this is not the growth curve that most people want. But I'm going to come back to that for just a second because I'm going to hit that at the end of my presentation. I've specifically done linear growth here, and I want to just pause there for a second. Now, I would argue that that's ideal. Low and slow is what I would say is most consistent with system thinking. What ends up happening is not this, though. If you've been in any organizations like I have, and I'm all about the failure thing, I share my pain, you get something like this. What's happening here? System value, product value starts out. You have a very high feature focus. You have a high feature dev ratio. So in a short amount of time, you spike up that product value, right? And then what happens? Your depreciation outflow loop starts to dominate. That tech debt starts setting in. And it starts to stagnate, right? And then it starts decreasing. Product value shoots up. You realize you're in trouble because it stops shooting up. All of a sudden, the system starts caving in on itself. And then somebody says, I have a solution to this problem. We're going to do a get well release. And it's going to fix all the things. So what we're going to do is we're going to stabilize our declining product value by spending a bunch of, really ramping, flipping that feature dev ratio on its head. We're going to focus on stability instead of on feature development. And we're going to do a get well release. Well, that's great, but what's happening is your development is not actually going, your product value is not actually increasing. You've bought yourself some time. And then what happens, somebody realizes, uh-oh, our competition is ahead of us. Slam on the gas again. We got to do more, got to do more features. We got to build more features. And then what happens is your stability hangover is worse than it was last time because your system is already bigger and more complex, and the system is actually kind of struggling under its own weight. And you're not able to kind of cover the distance because you have competition or your system is more complex, and you end up with like a rinse and repeat cycle as pathologically you're draining product value from your system. So this is many times, sadly, this is actually the model that actually happens when you're shooting for nonlinear growth in your system. So the question is, if you have this, how do you fix this? What is the approach? How do you conceptualize about the problem space? Now, if you've been paying attention, you've noticed that I've put value in quotes on every single slide. Product value is in quotes on every single slide. And I'm going to answer why I put product value in quotes on every single slide. And the reason I've done that is because the definition of value in that circumstance makes all the difference in the world. All the difference in the world. Let me go back to a Donella Meadows quote, or a second here, but I would argue that myopic product views that equate value purely with features are what's causing that type of issue. So you can pump whatever you want into that term value, and you're going to get what you're optimizing for. And that's the problem with that particular mindset. So the approach to kind of other, again, the Donella Meadows quotes is this, is that the way you do that is via value expansion. You have to aim to enhance your total systems properties, such as growth, stability, diversity, resilience, and sustainability, whether they are easily measured or not. You see, your version of value is what fed into that reinforcing loop that dictated the feature development ratio. That's what's doing that. And that's going back to the overarching goal. Again, we get a lot of mileage out of that overarching goal or function, is that's what's causing those issues. So I think she's spot on to say you have to expand your horizons. Don't just look at that value myopically, but look at it holistically. Again, this is tying those things together. The antidote to bounded rationality and sub-optimization is an overarching goal. The antidote to those type of pathological growth curves is a consistent and shared holistic definition of value. That's how you combat these systems problems. That's how you start rationalizing about them. So what does this look like in practice? I'm going to actually throw something out there. From the Google SRE book, reliability is the most important feature. I'm, again, kind of I'm biased here as an operations guy, so I think that this is something that resonates with me. I think this quote is actually from the Gmail team. The Gmail team rationalized about it like this. They're like, look, yes, we want to give you all the bells and whistles of the Gmail experience, but in all honesty, it's a whole lot better to get a 1990s email experience where you get your email versus not getting your email at all. And so that's how they rationalize about this. And the cool thing is you can take their model. If you've read the SRE book, you can take their model, and they've got their own approach to the system. You see what they've done is I've actually changed, if you looked at the desired, instead of desired product value, they have a service level objective there. A service level objective, I'm going to give you the quick summation of that right now. A service level objective is a quantifiable metric based on what they call a service level indicator. A service level indicator is some type of vector or some type of quantifiable number. For example, API calls, percent of API calls returned in 30 milliseconds to the P99, to that 99th percentile. Their objective would be that 99.99% of API calls return within 20 milliseconds within a P99. That's an objective. And the way they optimize their development teams is this, or they optimize their product teams is just this. They say, look, you can ship features until your heart's content as long as you stay within your error budget. You go under 99.99% ability, show stops. You have to completely flip feature development on its head. You do no more feature development. Everybody from the SREs to the development teams, you know what they have to do? They have to do quality development. They got to fix the problem. And so you know what? They actually take the subjectivity out of that, and they say, this is what it is. Now this is, the typical qualification. I know we're not Google. Most people here, I'm assuming, are not Google. But I think it's instructive to understand how they approach that problem and how we can see that problem is actually applicable. And that these are real solutions to these problems because you know what? We all suffer through them. If you're building software, this is a problem you're dealing with. Now let me give you my final thoughts here, and we'll wrap this up. A lot of ways system thinking has been liberating for me. And I've kind of approached this from the organizational side. I've approached this kind of from a technical side. But I think personally there's this concept of system thinking can help you be from a personal mastery. And when you realize that systems behave in a certain way, stocks are shock absorbers, systems change slowly, it really liberates you from a tremendous amount of frustration and kind of understanding the world. One of the books I'll recommend at the end has this quote where, like most technologists, we all have very high ideals on what we think the case ought to be, and reality is not there. So there's this gap between reality and our expectations, and that gap is, I think, many times addressed by the system thought because you realize that that gap's going to be there. And you can use that gap personally as an energy source, or you can just get frustrated with it. And so system thinking in a lot of ways has helped relieve that gap in my mind a little bit and help, but at the same time, realize that these things can be addressed. They can actually be dealt with. So I want to give you just some of the basics. Again, I've quoted liberally from the Meadows book, Thinking in Systems. It's awesome. The Fifth Discipline is another book that's high on that list. I would encourage each of you to become fluent in some of the primitives out there. We talked about those are like the grammar constructs. Understand some of those archetypes are really, really helpful. If you can build within your engineering organization or your IT organization, if you guys can all get on the same page about what these archetypes are, it really kind of puts some fluidity around your communication. It makes it a lot easier. And I would argue that the basics here of system thinking are actually essential for our engineering skill set. We have to have them. Another phenomenal book I didn't write on here is called Peopleware, and I mentioned that last year in my presentation. Peopleware talks about this paradigm shift from kind of factory, very kind of tactile, hands-on, very simple, kind of more problem-based to where we're at today as knowledge workers. The complexity of the situations, we deal with complexity. That's it. That's kind of what we do as knowledge workers. And it talks about all like the motivational and kind of organizational aspects of that. But I would also say there's a system thinking component of that, which says because we have to deal with systems every single day, complex systems every single day, it makes a whole lot of sense for us to put into our skill set what that means. So, last thing, I want to just wrap up here with a couple more slides. Accepting hard system truths. I'm going to give you a few of these right now. This is going to help with the frustration. Number one, systems push back. Hopefully you saw that with the biological examples. If you think you're going to like basically brute force your body into losing weight, what ends up happening is it like resets its homeostasis. It says, you spend a week on the treadmill, what I'm going to do is just basically reset and recalibrate my metabolism. That's true for every single system. Think of it as an organizational level. You can't do massive organizational changes without some pushback in that org. Pushing through there, this is a hard truth to accept. Right after a victory, expect a failure. You remember the cyclical oscillations of that graph? Almost certainly, systems will fail spectacularly after what's perceived as their biggest victory. And the reason is because there's inherent failures you're probably not seeing. Remember, cause and effect are not temporally close to one another, but so what you end up with is what seems like a very positive thing happening, but all the negative things you did months and weeks and months and years ago have finally caught up to you and that system fails hard. The rule of 5%. Don't expect more than 5% at the primary growth constraint. Remember I showed you that graph that's like kind of low and slow from a product value? The reason I say that is because of this particular model here. If you get more than, I know 5% is a rule of thumb, but it's like slow linear growth. But if you get more than 5% growth, expect a negative trade-off in a place you didn't expect. The whole thought process there is that people think things are going good when you're like racking up the credit card debt on your technical debt standpoint. But reality, what you're doing is you're digging yourself in a hole and your system's going to break in a way that you probably didn't expect it to. Like that's the 5% rule. And I think that 5% is pretty important because it kind of sets your expectations about what the system is going to do. Your system is running in degraded mode. Another 5% rule. I saw a rule of thumb. Every system runs at like 5% efficiency. That is startling. That is completely startling. I mean, if you think about the overhead we have if all of our systems run at 5% efficiency. I didn't have time to get in that, but I think we should probably go back and research and process that. Because every system's running in degraded mode, and at the end of the day, we need to fix that. And finally, most meaningful causes will not have effects that immediately follow them. This is so counterintuitive to everything that we've instructed. We've all talked about there's so many kind of counterintuitive thoughts. Many of you are probably familiar with the Mythical Man Month. Adding more software developers to a late project doesn't enhance it, it actually makes it later. This, again, is one of those truths that when you look at what system properties are, most meaningful causes are not immediately followed by their effects. This is absolutely critical. If you take nothing away, understand that dealing with complex systems at our level is going to have far temporal relationships. And so keep learning. That's why I'm just going to throw this quote in there. This might be a little bit of pie in the sky, but I think it's worth putting in there. Knowledge is the idea of uniting a lot of knowledge fronts across disciplines is critical. I was talking to my CTO, founder of the company, last year. This is, if you're familiar with some of the cybersecurity companies, RSA conferences, RSA is a big one. It's like a huge vendor bid out in San Francisco. He had just come back. I was like, yeah, you find anything interesting? You get any inspiration? He's looked at me and he said, no. I said, oh, okay. What do you mean? He's like, I don't go to RSA for inspiration. I go to South by Southwest for inspiration. He's like, my job is to solve the phishing problem. And I find more information and better equipped to do my job from looking at cross-disciplinary stuff than I do from seeing what all the other security vendors are doing. I mean, it was good. He said that very nicely, and it was a naive thing for me to ask, but like, he kind of hit me right here, you know? I mean, but that's so true. It's so true. So that's my talk. I appreciate everybody's attention. Again, for the group, thank you so much. Go learn system thinking.